You have 72 hours to stop that water, or half this neighborhood could be underwater. That was the first thing Laura Bennett, the county stormwater engineer, said to me after she saw what the HOA had done to my drainage ditch. 3 days earlier, I had come home to find a bulldozer sitting on my property and 40 feet of my drainage ditch buried beneath fresh soil. At the center of it stood a brand new gazebo, complete with cedar posts, stone footings, and a view that apparently mattered more to the HOA than where the rainwater was supposed to go. Madeline Pierce, the HOA president, was standing beside the contractor with a clipboard tucked against her chest. "It's community landscaping," she told me. "You can't interfere with an approved improvement." I looked at the ditch, then at the gazebo. "Who approved it?" She smiled. "The board." I had heard enough. I walked to the edge of the fill and noticed a small red survey marker sticking out of the dirt. I pulled away a layer of soil with my boot and found an old concrete drainage pipe underneath. That pipe had been there longer than the HOA itself. I went home, opened the metal filing cabinet in my office, and pulled out the original survey for my property. The drainage corridor was clearly marked. So was the easement. It had been recorded 27 years earlier. The HOA had been formed less than 6 years ago. But the survey showed something else that made me stop. The ditch wasn't simply carrying rainwater away from my property. It connected to a larger drainage system running downhill toward the neighborhood. I called Laura Bennett the next morning. She came out with measuring equipment and spent nearly an hour walking the drainage line. She barely spoke until we reached the section the HOA had filled. Then she crouched beside the buried pipe and stared at the blocked opening. "Who told them to do this?" she asked. "Madeline Pierce," I said. Laura stood up slowly. "Then she may have a much bigger problem than an unauthorized gazebo." That afternoon, the Weather Service issued a severe storm forecast. 5 inches of rain were possible over the next 72 hours. Laura showed me her calculations. With the ditch blocked, water would have nowhere to go except toward the lower streets of the subdivision. I called Madeline immediately and told her the construction had to stop. She didn't sound worried. "Ethan, you're making a mountain out of a drainage ditch." "No," I told her. "I'm trying to keep your neighborhood from becoming a lake." She hung up. That evening, I returned to the ditch with my camera and found fresh tire tracks beside the buried section. Someone had brought in another load of soil after I warned her. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from the contractor who built the gazebo. Attached was a video recorded at 2:13 that morning. I watched it once. Then again. The video showed someone standing beside the ditch with a flashlight, pointing toward the buried pipe. But the person wasn't a contractor. It was someone from the HOA. And what they did next changed everything I thought I knew about that gazebo. The video was only 11 seconds long, but it answered one question and created 3 more. The person in the frame was Greg Holloway, the contractor who had been hired to build the gazebo. He was standing beside the buried drainage pipe with Madeline Pierce and another man I did not recognize. Madeline pointed toward the pipe, then toward the stack of filled dirt. Greg said something I could not hear. Madeline shook her head and pointed again. Then the other man handed Greg a folded document. I froze the video on that moment. The document had a county seal at the top. I called Greg immediately. He did not answer. I called again. Nothing. So I drove to his office before sunrise. Greg was already there, sitting behind his desk with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. He looked exhausted. "You saw it," he said. I placed my phone on the desk. "I saw enough." Greg stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. "I was hoping I would never have to show you this." Inside was the original construction plan for the gazebo. The drawing showed the structure sitting 28 feet away from the drainage ditch. That was not where they had built it. The actual gazebo stood directly over the drainage corridor. "Why did they move it?" I asked. Greg rubbed his forehead. "Madeline told me the original location was too close to the water feature." I looked at him. "Water feature?" He nodded. That is what she called the ditch. Then he showed me the second page. It was a revised site plan dated 2 days before construction began. The drainage corridor was gone. Not moved. Not marked differently. Gone. Someone had removed it from the drawing. I asked Greg who had given him the revised plan. He hesitated. Madeline brought it herself. That was the first real answer I had gotten, and somehow it made the situation worse. I called Daniel Mercer, the attorney I had used for property matters for years. He met me that afternoon at the county records office. We pulled the original easement, the subdivision plat, the drainage maintenance agreement, and every permit connected to the gazebo. The original records were consistent. The ditch was protected. The new site plan was not. Then Daniel found something I had not expected. The permit application listed the gazebo as a landscaping improvement with no impact on stormwater flow. Daniel looked at me over the folder. That statement matters. Before I could answer, Laura Bennett walked into the records room. She had a tablet in one hand and a worried expression on her face. Ethan, I just finished reviewing the rainfall model. She turned the screen toward us. The forecast had changed. The storm was arriving earlier than expected. 48 hours. Laura pointed to the blocked drainage corridor. If they leave this filled, the water is going somewhere. Daniel closed the folder. Then we need to know exactly where. Laura looked at me. I think I can show you. She opened a second map. The drainage line continued far beyond my property, straight underneath the oldest section of the neighborhood. And at the end of that line was something none of us had seen on the new plans. That line ends here, Laura said, tracing the map with her finger. And that is exactly where the original drainage plan shows the neighborhood retention basin. I leaned closer. The basin had been constructed 20 years earlier, long before Madeline Pierce became HOA president. It was designed to receive stormwater from my property, pass it beneath the main road, and release it gradually into a creek beyond the subdivision. But on the revised plan Greg had given us, the retention basin was labeled as a landscaped community park. The drainage connection had disappeared completely. How did nobody catch this? I asked. Laura looked at Daniel. Because the new plan was submitted as a landscaping modification, not a drainage modification. Daniel tapped the paper. Which means someone may have intentionally kept the stormwater changes out of the application. That was the moment the gazebo stopped being the center of the story. The structure was only the visible part. Someone had changed the map underneath it. I drove back to my property before sunset and walked the entire drainage corridor with Laura. She measured the slope every 50 feet while I photographed every blocked inlet, buried marker, and fresh section of fill. At the far end, we found a concrete access box hidden behind ornamental shrubs. It was supposed to provide maintenance access to the underground drainage line. A new stone border had been installed directly over the access point. Laura crouched down and brushed away the soil around the cover. This was accessible last month, she said. Someone deliberately covered it. I called Madeline. She answered on the third ring. Ethan, I am in the middle of a board meeting. Then you should know your landscaping project is blocking a drainage system. There was a pause. Our engineer approved everything. Which engineer? That is not your concern. It becomes my concern when the water crosses my property. Her voice hardened. You are making this unnecessarily difficult. I kept my voice calm. I am asking you to stop changing the drainage system before the storm arrives. She replied with a sentence I would remember for a long time. The storm is not our problem. Then she hung up. 10 minutes later, Laura received an alert on her tablet. The storm forecast had been upgraded. The expected rainfall had increased to nearly 5 inches in less than 24 hours. She looked at me and then at the blocked corridor. We have a serious problem. That night, Daniel filed an emergency notice with the county. I thought that would finally force the HOA to stop. Instead, the next morning, I found 3 new loads of soil covering the ditch. Someone had continued the work after the county had been notified. And beside the fresh dirt was a wooden stake bearing a handwritten number, 14. Laura stared at it for several seconds. 14 what? I asked. She shook her head. I do not know yet. Then she opened the stormwater map again and counted the homes connected to the block drainage line. There were 14 houses in the lowest section of the neighborhood. The number on the stake was not a measurement. It was a warning about who would be affected first. 14 houses, Laura said. If the water backs up here, these are the first properties in its path. I looked at the map again. 14 small circles marked the lowest section of the neighborhood, each connected to the same drainage line that the HOA had just buried. There were families living in those homes, and most of them probably had no idea what was happening beneath their streets. I could not leave it that way. I called Daniel before sunrise. We need to get those homeowners informed, I said. And we need everything documented before the storm arrives. By 8 in the morning, Laura and I were walking the drainage corridor again. This time, we followed the line all the way to the retention basin. The basin looked normal from the road, with trimmed grass, a walking path, and a row of young trees along the edge. But underneath the landscaping, something was wrong. Laura opened the maintenance access box and found nearly 2 feet of sediment blocking the inlet. This has not been cleaned in years, she said. I looked toward the new gazebo in the distance. Who is responsible for maintaining it? She checked the county records. The HOA. That was another piece of the puzzle. The HOA had not simply blocked a functioning drainage ditch. They had neglected the system they were responsible for while building over part of it. Daniel arrived with copies of the maintenance agreement. He read through the pages, then stopped at one paragraph. There is an annual inspection requirement. Did they do it? I asked. He shook his head. Not according to these records. Then my phone rang. It was one of the homeowners from the lower section. Her name was Susan Miller. She told me she had noticed water collecting near her driveway after the last heavy rain. I asked when it started. About 3 weeks ago, she said. 3 weeks. That was almost exactly when the gazebo construction began. I asked if she had reported it to the HOA. She had. Madeline had told her it was normal seasonal runoff. Susan had even sent photographs. Daniel immediately asked her to forward them. When the images arrived, Laura compared them with the construction timeline. The water pattern had changed after the ditch was partially filled. It was not random. It was following the new path created by the soil and the berm. Then Susan sent one more photograph. It showed a county drainage marker that had been standing beside the ditch for years. In the latest photograph, the marker was gone. Laura zoomed in and went silent. Ethan, that marker identifies the protected drainage corridor. I felt the pieces finally connect. The missing corridor on the revised plan, the buried pipe, the covered access box, the neglected retention basin, and now the missing marker were not separate mistakes. Someone had systematically erased every visible sign that the drainage system existed. I called Madeline one more time. We need to talk, I said. About what? She asked. About the drainage system your board removed from the plans. Her answer came without hesitation. There is no drainage system on that property. I looked at Laura. She slowly shook her head. Then Daniel placed the original survey on the hood of my truck. We have the recorded easement, he said. They cannot make it disappear. Before I could respond, Laura's tablet sounded. The storm had accelerated again. We now had less than 12 hours before the heaviest rainfall was expected. And then Laura noticed something on the radar map that made her face change completely. The storm was moving directly toward the 14 houses marked on her map. The storm was 12 hours away, and for the first time since this started, I understood that waiting was no longer an option. I called Susan Miller and asked her to contact the other 13 homeowners immediately. Tell them to move anything valuable away from the lowest floors, I said. And tell them to watch the water, not the weather report. I did not want panic. I wanted people prepared. Within an hour, Daniel had sent the original drainage documents to the county emergency office. while Laura contacted the stormwater department and requested an immediate field inspection. I drove back toward the HOA clubhouse, where Madeline Pierce was meeting with several board members. The gazebo stood behind them, almost finished. Cedar beams, stone base, fresh landscaping. It looked harmless. That was the problem. It looked harmless because nobody could see what had been buried underneath it. Madeline stepped outside when she saw me. "You are causing unnecessary alarm," she said. 14 homeowners are now asking questions because of you." I kept my voice steady. "They are asking questions because their drainage system was altered." She folded her arms. "The board has an engineer. Then let your engineer explain the missing drainage corridor." Her expression changed for just a second. It was small, but I noticed it. "There is no missing corridor," she said. "The plans were updated." "By whom?" She did not answer. Daniel stepped beside me and handed her a copy of the original recorded easement. "This document has been in the county records for 27 years, he said. "Your revised plan does not erase it." Madeline looked at the paper, then handed it back. "Our attorney will handle this." She turned toward the clubhouse. That should have been the end of the conversation, but one of the contractors approached us before she went inside. It was Greg Holloway. He looked nervous. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." Madeline stopped walking. Greg looked at her, then at me. "The soil was not supposed to go that deep." Madeline immediately told him to speak with her later. Greg shook his head. "No. They told us to cover the access box completely." Laura looked at him. "Who told you?" Greg swallowed and pointed toward the clubhouse. "Madeline's project manager." Then he pulled a folded work order from his pocket. The document listed the original scope of work, including one instruction that had never appeared on the permit application: remove the drainage marker, cover the maintenance access, and redirect surface water toward the retention basin. Laura read the sentence twice. "This is not landscaping," she said quietly. "This is a drainage modification." Greg nodded. "And there is more." He opened his phone and showed us a message from the developer overseeing the next phase of the neighborhood. It said the drainage corridor needed to be cleared before construction could begin. Daniel looked at me. "Now we know why they wanted the ditch gone." But before we could examine the message further, sirens sounded in the distance. Not emergency sirens. County vehicles. 3 trucks turned onto the neighborhood road and stopped near the gazebo. Laura checked her tablet. Her face tightened. The first heavy rain band had arrived 6 hours earlier than predicted. And the 14 homes were directly downstream. The county trucks stopped beside the gazebo just as the first steady rain began falling. Laura stepped toward the lead vehicle and spoke with the stormwater inspector, while I watched water gather along the edge of the freshly graded ground. Within minutes, the shallow flow that should have entered the drainage ditch was spreading across the lawn instead. The inspector, Thomas Reed, walked over with a tablet in his hand. "Are you Ethan Caldwell?" he asked. "Yes." He looked toward the buried drainage corridor. "Then I need you to show me exactly what changed." I led him to the red survey marker, the covered access box, and the section of ditch that had been filled. Laura handed him the original county records. Thomas studied them carefully. "This is not shown on the current site plan," he said. "That is the problem," Daniel replied. Madeline Pierce came out of the clubhouse with 2 board members behind her. "This inspection is unnecessary," she said. Thomas did not argue. He simply asked, "Who authorized the alteration of the drainage corridor?" Madeline pointed toward the contractor. "The construction company handled the site work." Greg immediately shook his head. "That is not what the work order says." Madeline turned toward him, but Greg kept his voice calm. He handed Thomas the document he had shown us earlier. Thomas read it slowly. His expression changed when he reached the instruction about removing the drainage marker and covering the maintenance access. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "The project manager gave it to me," Greg said. Thomas photographed every page. Then he walked to the retention basin. Laura followed him, and I went with them. The rain was getting heavier. Water was already collecting near the basin entrance, but the blocked inlet prevented it from entering normally. Thomas checked the elevation readings and looked back toward the gazebo. "The fill has changed the flow path," he said. "If the rainfall increases, the basin may not receive the water at the rate it was designed for." Daniel looked at me. "That means the entire drainage model has been compromised." Then Thomas received a message on his tablet. He read it twice before speaking. "There is another issue." He showed us an aerial image from 3 years earlier. Beyond the retention basin was a large undeveloped tract of land. On the current development map, that same area was marked as Phase 2. The developer planned to build another 80 homes there. But the original drainage corridor crossed directly through the proposed construction area. "They could not build Phase 2 with this drainage route," Laura said. Greg looked down. "That is why they wanted the ditch gone." Madeline stepped closer. "That is speculation." Thomas turned toward her. "Then you should have no problem providing the complete engineering file." She hesitated. That hesitation told us more than any argument could have. Thomas requested the original stormwater calculations, the revised site plan, the contractor instructions, and every approval connected to the project. Madeline said her attorney would provide them. Thomas nodded. "Then we will wait." He looked toward the sky as the rain intensified. "But the water will not wait." A few minutes later, a homeowner came running from the lower street and called out that water was already pooling around several driveways. Laura checked the drainage readings. The numbers were climbing quickly. Then Thomas received another message. He looked at me and said, "Ethan, this just became an environmental compliance matter." "Environmental compliance?" I asked. Thomas Reed nodded. "The drainage system is connected to a larger stormwater network, and someone altered it without properly documenting the change." The rain continued falling as he opened a new inspection file on his tablet. For the first time, Madeline Pierce stopped talking. She had spent days calling the buried ditch landscaping, but now a county inspector was treating it as regulated infrastructure. Thomas asked for the complete engineering records. Madeline said her attorney would provide them. Thomas replied that the records needed to be produced immediately because the storm was already affecting the system. Then he turned to me. "Ethan, I need the original survey, the maintenance agreement, and every photograph you have taken since construction started." I handed him the files I had been collecting since the first morning. He reviewed the photographs one by one. The missing marker. The covered access box. The buried pipe. The new soil. Every image established a timeline. Laura stood beside him, comparing the photographs with the drainage model. Then she stopped. "Thomas, look at this." She pointed to an image taken before construction. The drainage marker was clearly visible. Next to it was a second marker farther downhill. Thomas pulled up the current site plan. The second marker was missing from that document too. "There are 2 markers," he said. "Both disappeared from the revised plan." Daniel looked toward Greg. "Was the second marker removed?" Greg nodded. "Yes. The project manager told us it was no longer necessary." Thomas wrote something on his tablet. Then another county vehicle arrived. A woman named Karen Ellis stepped out carrying a waterproof folder. She introduced herself as an environmental compliance investigator working with the Regional Environmental Office. She had been contacted after Thomas reported the altered drainage corridor. Madeline immediately asked whether this was really necessary. Karen calmly replied, "That depends on what we find." She requested the original and revised plans. Greg provided his copy. Karen compared them for nearly a minute. "Why does the drainage corridor disappear here?" she asked. Madeline said the engineer determined it was unnecessary. Karen looked at the engineering signature. "This signature does not belong to the engineer listed on the original permit." Daniel stepped closer. "Are you saying someone signed this under another person's name?" Karen shook her head. "I am saying I need to verify who authorized this revision." Then she found the project manager's name on the work order Greg had provided. It matched the name on the developer's Phase 2 application. That was the connection we had been missing. The gazebo was not an isolated improvement. It was part of a larger development plan. Karen requested the Phase 2 drainage documents. Madeline said they were confidential. Karen answered, "Not if they are relevant to an environmental compliance investigation." Madeline finally called her attorney. While she stepped away, Karen examined the stormwater map again. Her expression changed when she saw the proposed 80-home expansion. "This project depends on this drainage corridor remaining functional," she said. "If someone altered it to make additional land available for construction, that changes the entire investigation." The rain intensified outside. Water was beginning to collect along the lower street, but the retention basin was still holding. Then Karen received an email containing the original engineering package for Phase 2. She opened the first page and stared at it. "Ethan," she said quietly, "your drainage ditch is not just protecting these 14 homes." She turned the screen toward me. The original plan showed the drainage corridor continuing underneath the future development site. Then I saw a handwritten note beside the line. It was dated 6 months before the gazebo project began. The note said, "Relocate drainage before Phase 2 approval." And beneath it was a name I recognized immediately, Madeline Pierce. The name on that note changed everything. Madeline Pierce had not simply approved a gazebo. She had been planning to move the drainage system months before construction even began. Karen Ellis photographed the handwritten note and saved the original engineering file to the investigation record. "This is significant," she said. Madeline returned from her phone call and immediately asked what was happening. Karen held up the document. "We found a planning note connected to the Phase 2 development." Madeline glanced at it and said, "That is an old draft. It means nothing." Daniel stepped forward. "Then why does it specifically say to relocate the drainage before Phase 2 approval?" Madeline did not answer. Outside, the rain intensified. Water was beginning to collect along the lower streets, and several homeowners had moved their vehicles to higher ground. Laura checked the retention basin again. "We are reaching capacity faster than expected," she said. Thomas Reed immediately ordered the construction area closed and instructed the contractor not to add any more fill. Greg looked relieved. "I have been trying to tell them this for weeks." Karen asked Greg for every communication he had received from the project manager. He opened his phone and began forwarding messages. There were dozens. One message from 6 months earlier stood out. It said the drainage corridor had to be resolved before the developer could finalize Phase 2. Another message instructed the contractor to make the new landscaping appear continuous, so the original drainage route would not be obvious from the road. Daniel read the message twice. They were not just changing the drainage system. They were trying to make the change difficult to detect. Madeline finally spoke. "You are all misunderstanding the project." Karen looked at her calmly. "Then explain the documents." Madeline said the HOA was improving property values and creating a better community space. Karen replied, "That does not authorize an unapproved alteration to a regulated drainage system." Then Thomas received a new report from the lower section of the neighborhood. Water had begun entering 2 driveways. Laura checked the flow readings and immediately called the emergency maintenance crew. "We need to reopen the original drainage path," she said. The county crew began removing the newest layer of fill from the access area. Within minutes, water started moving toward the buried pipe. The flow was slow at first, then steadier as the blocked section opened. Nobody celebrated. Everyone was watching the readings. The 14 homeowners were still waiting to see whether the system could handle the storm. Then Karen received another document from the environmental office. It was the original permit application for the Phase 2 development. The drainage corridor was clearly marked as protected infrastructure. Karen looked at Madeline. "You knew this was here." Madeline said nothing. Karen continued. "You also knew the proposed development depended on relocating it." Daniel looked at me. They were trying to solve a $1 million development problem with a landscaping project. I looked toward the gazebo. Its cedar frame was still standing, but the ground around it was saturated and the original drainage path was slowly returning. Then Karen received the final inspection calculation. She read it silently, then looked at Thomas. If the corridor had remained blocked through the peak rainfall, the downstream properties could have suffered extensive flooding. Thomas nodded. And because the alteration was unauthorized, the restoration costs will be assigned to whoever caused it. Madeline's expression changed for the first time. Karen closed the file. This is no longer a warning. She looked directly at Madeline. This is an environmental enforcement action. Then she handed Thomas another page. It contained the preliminary restoration estimate. The number at the bottom was $250,000. The number on that page was not a threat. It was the price of making the drainage system right again. By the time the storm reached its peak, the county crew had reopened the original drainage path and cleared the blocked access point. Water began moving through the buried pipe exactly as the original engineers had designed it. Laura stood beside me watching the readings stabilize. The system is working, she said. The 14 homes are no longer in the danger zone. I looked toward the gazebo. Its cedar frame was still standing, but the ground around it had become part of the evidence. The construction had changed the drainage path, and now the restoration order required the altered section to be returned to its original condition. The next morning, Karen Ellis delivered the official enforcement notice. The HOA had to remove the fill, restore the drainage corridor, reopen the maintenance access, correct the retention basin, and pay the full restoration and enforcement costs. The preliminary figure was $250,000. Madeline tried to argue that the contractor had made the decisions without her knowledge. Greg provided the work orders. Daniel provided the recorded easement. Laura provided the engineering measurements. Karen provided the messages showing that Madeline had known exactly what the drainage corridor was for. The documents told the story without anyone needing to raise their voice. A week later, the excavation began. The soil covering the original ditch was removed carefully, layer by layer, until the old drainage channel appeared again. The concrete pipe was inspected and cleared. The maintenance box was uncovered. The missing survey markers were replaced. The retention basin was cleaned and restored to its original capacity. The gazebo could not remain where it had been built because the restored drainage corridor ran directly beneath its footprint. The HOA had to remove it as part of the restoration order. Madeline did not attend the final inspection. By then, the board had already voted to remove her as president. The Phase 2 development was also placed on hold while the environmental review continued. The 80-home expansion that had depended on relocating the drainage system could not move forward until the original water management plan was properly addressed. Susan Miller called me after the final inspection. She said the 14 homeowners had been talking about what happened, and most of them had never known the drainage system existed. We thought the HOA was just building a gazebo, she said. So did I told her. Until I saw where the water was supposed to go. She laughed softly. I guess the ditch was more important than the gazebo. She was right. I stood beside the restored drainage channel that evening as a light rain moved across the property. The water entered the ditch, followed the original slope, passed through the cleared pipe, and continued toward the retention basin. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. The system simply worked the way it had been designed to work for decades. I kept the original survey in my office, along with the photographs, the work orders, and the enforcement documents. I never wanted the HOA's money. I never wanted their gazebo. I wanted them to understand that property rights and infrastructure records are not suggestions. They are there for a reason. The final restoration bill came to exactly $250,000. The HOA paid it. The drainage corridor remained protected. The Phase 2 project remained under review. And every time rain falls now, the water follows the same path it always did, quietly proving that the ditch they thought they could bury was never just a ditch.